There was a massive bond buying spree in Europe among European banks. And according to the latest data from the ECB, it was the third most on record. Haven't seen anything like this in a single month since April of 2020. At the same time, European banks, they don't want to lend to the real economy. They're cutting back. This comes the day after China announces that it's starting its bank bailout, and then the Europeans report this. Even banks in the US, they're doing the same things. In other words, banks around the world are becoming more, not less, defensive. And one reason why is that interest rates are not what they tell you. Lower rates are higher risk perceptions, heightened demand for safety and liquidity. Exactly what the global banking system is doing right now, and then some. Now, central bankers tell you that lower rates are stimulus and that they work by stimulating more borrowing activity, but that's just not true. And European banks, as much as Chinese banks, they're a perfect example, both historically as well as what's happening over there right now at this minute. Instead, the whole thing, bank lending, bond buying, the economy that forgot how to grow, it's all about risk perceptions, and there's little, if anything, central banks can do about them. The best that they can hope is to fool the public just enough for the public to overcome its natural skepticism. But like bankers, the public isn't foolish enough to follow all that folly. And so lower interest rates signal growing problems and growing distress. Ever since the Swiss National Bank kicked off the rate cutting cycle last March, it's only been getting worse, not better. The outlook is increasingly negative, not positive. Central bankers only react to what's happening in the real economy. They don't have any ability to change it. The banks do. Well, what are the banks doing? The exact opposite. European, Chinese, American banks, they're living proof. Defensiveness is on the rise everywhere. The forgot how to grow economy starts with banks that forgot how to lend. And while they forgot how to lend, they sure didn't forget where the bonds are. They've been on a bond buying spree globally, and this is a big one over there in Europe. In fact, the data that just came out today from the European Central Bank for the banking system as a whole, massive increase in the month of January, the third most on record for any single month. It was an increase of 83.6 billion euros. That compared to 89.2 billion, the last time we saw anything close to that, in April of 2020. And of course, April 2020 was also March and May, where we saw about 75 billion each in those. That tells you everything that you need to know about why banks are buying government bonds. They do so because they're becoming defensive, safety and liquidity. And the heightened demand for safety and liquidity means lower interest rates, an expression of lower growth and inflation expectations. When everybody demands safety, you know there's not going to be a lot going on in terms of growth prospects. The biggest monthly increase for government bond holdings among European banks goes back to October of 2010, right in the middle of the European sovereign debt crisis, when European banks were buying certain government bonds and not some of the others. The growing concerns that Europe and the global economy as a whole were not recovering from the Great Not Recession, which was just a couple years before then. Since last January, so going back to last January when everything was supposed to be turning around and picking up in Europe, European banks have added an astonishing 304 billion euros worth of government bonds in that 1 year period. So 12 months, 304 billion, which is a 19% increase, nearly 20% increase in government bond holdings during 2024 and into the first month of 2025, when again, everything is supposed to be going in the opposite direction, including interest rates. Interest rates are supposed to be spurring lending, and instead, the only thing that's happening is European banks are buying tons and tons of government bonds. They are literally not buying the pickup in the economy, instead, only safety. Now, we can see to an extent why they were buying so much in January, because as I mentioned in a couple days ago in a previous video, dollar shortage drove treasury yields higher, increased the sell-off. Reserve managers responding to the dollar shortage in December and into the middle of January. Treasuries were sold to raise funds that could be used to help out and help alleviate the dollar shortage in these local jurisdictions, which drove treasury rates substantially higher, which pulled up European rates along with them. And as European rates went up and bond prices went down, European banks said, thank you very much. I'll take this opportunity to buy as many government bonds as we can because we're increasingly defensive and pessimistic about prospects in Europe. So a lower price for government bonds, a lower price for safety and liquidity, sign us up for that. And so they piled into government bonds. And when the dollar shortage finally stopped in the middle of January, interest rates went lower in Europe, same as everywhere else. And so since the middle of January, U.S. Treasury yields have tracked back with their German counterparts because they always converge one with the other. The German ones tend to be more directly in line with fundamentals. The dollar shortage was one factor. Fed uncertainty, Jay Powell not really understanding what it is he wants to do. But since then, after you pass the dollar shortage, the acute phase of that dollar shortage, a little more clarity on the economy, the growth scares back in Europe, or in the U.S. as well as Europe, suddenly interest rates are converging, long-term U.S. Treasury back down with the German counterparts. Like banks, the market is becoming increasingly defensive. Treasury yields weren't rising in December and early January because of heightened inflation expectations over trade wars or pickup in the economy or whatever other factor that got cited. It was a technical factor related to deflationary circumstances that the European banking system was actually picking up on and saying, thank you very much for it. I'm going to buy a huge amount of safety and liquidity. On the other side of that, there's the loan data. What the ECB shows for European banks as a whole is, again, they're becoming increasingly defensive. While they bought $304 billion in government bonds over the previous 12 months up to the end of January 2025, total loans among all European banks only increased by 274.7 billion euros, or about 1.9%. And 1.9% is basically a rounding error. That's nowhere near what Europe needs to break free from its prolonged, protracted recession. And a lot of that lending was to non-MFIs financial firms. So in other words, investment funds. When you exclude those investment funds, total loans to the rest of the European system only increased by 158.2 billion euros in these last 12 months. And some of that, though, was loans to other miscellaneous categories. And when you look at strictly households and non-financial corporations or businesses, European bank lending to the real economy, only increased by 141.5 billion over the same 12-month period. That's less than half the amount of government bonds that they bought, that European banks piled into their balance sheets. And since July of 2024, the increase in the balance of loans to households and non-financial corporations, just 71 billion. So during the same time frame, July being the month after the rate cut started the ECB, and right when the rate cut started to accelerate in September, since then, lending to households and businesses in Europe has actually slowed down. It didn't pick up. Interest rates didn't actually make any difference. If anything, European banks are becoming more defensive, not less. It's not stimulating lending. It's not stimulating an economy or a recovery. It's not doing anything. What European banks are saying is that they're becoming more pessimistic, not less. And not only are they saying that, they're acting on it, buying government bonds and cutting back on lending to the real economy. Again, all of this is consistent with the forgot how to grow stuff. And what the forgot how to grow economy really is, it's a different kind of recession than what most people are familiar with. And that's something that we've been talking about at Eurodollar University in our deep dive analysis, as well as our other subscriptions too. Check out what the deep dive analysis is and everything that goes on with it, including Eurodollar University's AI, at our website, eurodollar.university. We've got the deep dive analysis. We've got the daily briefing subscription. Keeps you up to date on everything that's happening every day, including today, where we go over the details behind the European bank data. Plus, there's a Eurodollar University memberships where we talk about all of these monetary, financial characteristics, developments in history, a whole ton of data and information available so that you can make sense of everything that's going on. Why are banks doing what they're doing? What do interest rates actually mean? Because it's not what they say in the mainstream. So check out Eurodollar University subscriptions, deep dive analysis, daily briefing, memberships, eurodollar.university. A lot of the problems start with the fact that central banks have conditioned the public through the financial media, which doesn't know any better, that lower interest rates are stimulus. And so everybody thinks that when rates go down, that must be positive. Things are picking up. And the reason that we believe this is because it sounds intuitive, right? If interest rates go down, that means the cost of borrowing is less, therefore there should be more borrowing. But even if that was true, and it's not, even if it was true, there's an entire other side of that equation. What about those who are supposed to extend the loans? If interest rates go down, like we see in China, do they actually want to extend more loans? Because rates go down, that means, well, there's probably not as much profitability in doing so. But it doesn't, nominal interest rates don't make that's not the primary factor. The primary factor here is all about risk perceptions. But central banks they absolutely have to keep this myth alive. Otherwise, central banks are completely out of a job. It goes back to 1991, the quotes I bring up about Alan Greenspan talking about how the Fed didn't really want to target interest rates, but that's the only thing that they had left to do. And since it's the only thing that central banks have left to do, they can't intervene in the monetary system. They wouldn't even know where to begin. Since all they have is interest rates, they've spent the last 30, really longer than 30 years, convincing the public that interest rates are the only thing that matter. And in trying to do so, they also convince the public that interest rates going down mean stimulus and going up mean tightening. When in reality, throughout history, we don't see that relationship at all. In European bank data, just like the Chinese bank data, or US bank data for that matter, perfect representation of this myth. You go back to the early 2000s. The eruption of the global dot-com recession wasn't just a U.S. recession. It was indeed a global recession because this is a globally synchronized economy. So what do you see? European bank lending starts to slow down materially 2001, 2002, 2003 as the recession develops, and it hits Europe too. So as lending slows down, that means that banks are becoming more risk averse. And at the same time that lending slows down, what do we see? Interest rates that are going down. So there is a direct correlation. Lower levels of lending or slowdown in lending, slower growth in lending, and lower interest rates when it's supposed to be the opposite. Lower interest rates are supposed to stimulate lending, really stimulate borrowing, but they didn't in this case. And then on the flip side, you go to the middle 2000s. What happens? Fearing inflation. Central banks, not just the United States went earlier, but the European Central Bank comes along later. They start raising short-term interest rates, get short-term interest rates to go up, trying to put a restraint on lending, therefore restrain the economy, therefore, in their theories, restraining inflationary pressures. But what happens from the beginning? What happens to lending? Lending continues to be robust. It doesn't even skip a beat, even as the ECB, like the Fed, is raising rates in the middle of 2000. There is no correlation between interest rates and the direction of interest rates and lending growth. And then lending growth abruptly stops in the crisis in 2008. Doesn't fall off, doesn't crash, but it goes sideways, which is the same thing as a crash. So lending in Europe, like lending in the United States and elsewhere around the world, suddenly stops growing. At the same time, what? Interest rates are going down. So interest rates going down are not sparking and spurring new lending. They reflect the lower growth and inflation expectations that are also reflected in banks that don't want to extend loans. Rates crash while lending goes sideways. There's no relationship there, except that looking at both of those as a symptom of the wider problem. And even after the crisis, this is the most damning evidence that you'll see. Rates continue to go lower and lower and lower. And like we see in the United States, lending in Europe goes nowhere. It doesn't matter how low rates go or the tactics the ECB employ to try to calm the situation and get the economy restarted. Lending continues to go sideways throughout the first half of the 2010s. And then in the second half of the 2010s, while lending starts to grow again, it grows again in a very lackluster fashion, nowhere near what the economy needs, nor something like the pre-crisis era. And that's with interest rates down, the short-term interest rates down at zero, and some interest rates that got into the negatives for reasons that have nothing to do with spurring interest rates or spurring lending. So no correlation between borrowing, lending, and nominal interest rates. And we see the same thing again in the 2020s, starting in 2022. While interest rates were beginning to rise in the middle of 2022 as the ECB hiked rates and other market interest rates were going up, bank lending stopped growing because of the same reasons that we saw before, whether it be 2000, 2001, or in 2008 or 2012. Bank lending starts to retreat because of risk perceptions, not rising interest rates. And so that's why bank lending leveled off and stayed sideways. Banks forgot how to lend since late 2022, simply because it has nothing to do with interest rates. It has entirely to do with the forgot how to grow economy and risk perceptions that go along with it. So because it wasn't rising interest rates that stopped lending, You're not going to see a pickup, a material pickup, or a meaningful change in lending as interest rates go down. There is some marginal activity that goes along with interest rates. There are interest rate sensitive sectors of the economy, but they don't determine the overall direction of what banks are doing, nor the overall economy either. So as interest rates are coming down, reflecting first of all the low growth and inflation expectations in the marketplace beyond the banking system, as well as in the banking system, but more importantly, that central bankers are being forced now to recognize these conditions and lower short-term interest rates too. Short-term interest rates, central bank policies are following along what the market has been saying, following along with the forgot how to grow economy, and the European banking system, rather than seeing that as a solution, says this is likely consistent with signs that show things are getting worse, not better. Thus, European banks are becoming more defensive, not less. And none of this should be a surprise. First of all, the historical precedents here, the pattern, the historical evidence, which is everywhere, not just in Europe, it's all over the place. But even more than that, just more recently, the European banks told the ECB they were becoming more and more defensive. In Europe, the European Central Bank's quarterly bank lending survey, or BLS, for the fourth quarter, back in October, the report says this: the renewed net tightening follows unchanged credit standards for loans to firms in the third quarter of 2024 and is the most pronounced net tightening since the third quarter of 2023. It was driven by higher perceived risk related to the economic outlook and by banks' lower risk tolerance. I mean, they're basically spelling it out here. This was mainly owing to banks in Germany and France in an environment of increased political uncertainty where credit standards had eased in Italy. And they got that part backwards too. It wasn't that banks were becoming increasingly risk averse because of the political upset in France and Germany. Remember, the political upset in France and Germany, the government's collapsing there, were both symptoms of the economic conditions in both of those places. So European banks were, at the end of 2023, starting to become a little bit more optimistic. Largely because at the end of 2023, the recession in Europe had already been a year at that point. Figuring, okay, a year, maybe things will start getting better. And so they loosened credit standards a little bit, but nothing really changed in 2024. Instead, banks became more and more pessimistic and acted on that pessimism by not really extending more loans, as well as buying tons and tons of government bonds. So by the end of 2024, seeing that nothing had really changed since the end of 2023, banks started to tighten lending standards all over again. As risk averse as they had been in the interim, they became even more risk averse and then acted on it, which is what the data shows for January 2025. So as I said, none of this is a surprise. It is a surprise to maybe people in the public and the mainstream who get confused, understandably, because central banks and economics does such a horrible job of explaining what it is that central banks actually do. It's not monetary policies, it's interest rate policies. And interest rate policies are backward. And the reason interest rate policies are backward is because that's the only way a central banker can have a job. It's not exactly what they teach you in school, nor what they tell you all throughout the mainstream. So we already knew that the entire system was becoming more risk averse as interest rates have been going lower since the end of 2023, and even more so among European banks when lower interest rates were supposed to have spurred more lending. They didn't, and European banks have been piling on massive amounts of government bonds. And if this was just something that we saw in only Europe, that would be one thing. That would already be a big concern because Europe is a huge economy and is a major contributor to the global system. But we don't see it just in Europe. We see the same types of behavior in China as well as the United States. Exactly the same type of defensive, not willing to lend to the real economy, doing some financial stuff, but mostly safety and liquidity. So this verdict that applies to Europe also applies everywhere else. What the banking system globally and authorities' reactions to conditions in the banking system, as well as the real economy, tell you the forgot how to grow economy is more likely than not, and very likely, to forget how to grow even more here in 2025. Given everything I just said, China picking right now to start its bank recapitalization bailout plan actually makes sense. Went over the details behind it in the video link below. As always, thank you very much for joining me. Huge thank you, Eurodollar University members and subscribers. If you want to become one, check out our website, eurodollar.university. And until next time, take care.